So thank you, Patricia, for the generous introduction. And I don't often speak in book fairs. The last time, I think, was in Paris. But I'm very happy to speak in this kind of environment, since my father was a bookseller and I grew up in a house full of books. I think as a child, I imagined every house was going to be so full of books. But instead of following him into the book business, I became a cultural historian, and as you heard, I've been working in the last few years on the history of knowledge. And the rise of the history of knowledge is actually a major recent trend in historical studies. Most of the books and articles on this subject have been published since the year 2000. And so some people study cultures of knowledge, whether in different parts of the world or sometimes different cultures of knowledge within the same city. Other people work on what they call places of knowledge, lieux de savoir, which is the title of 2 huge volumes published in Paris a few years ago, on the model of the still more famous lieux de mémoire, that very ambitious collection of volumes that were planned by Pierre Nora, a very interesting individual because he has one foot in the academic world and the other foot in the publishing house of Gallimard. So other places of knowledge, laboratories, observatories, schools, universities, archives, libraries, and of course, bookshops and publishing houses. And within this field, this expanding field, then scholars have been showing increasing interest in the circulation of ideas. Recent books and articles have titles like Knowledge in Motion, Knowledge in Transit, Knowledge on the Move. So how should one study the circulation of knowledge? One way is to study the circulation of books. It's a bit like the detectives who follow the money in order to find out where the criminals are. Well, you can follow the books in order to discover where knowledge is circulating. The history of the book, and of course a still older discipline, bibliography, much longer established, began with studying topics like this. But if one's going to study the circulation of books, it's also important to study the circulation of the people who write them, who sell them. In other words, authors, printers, booksellers, and what we now call publishers. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the term publisher is anachronistic. The function of publishing was something that the printers and booksellers did. So, going back to the age of Gutenberg, at that time, the printers themselves circulated. So, the printing press, the first one set up in Mainz, and then presses are founded all over Europe. But what's interesting is that generally in the first generation or two, they were founded by German printers who simply went to new places, to new countries, in order to be the first person to set up a press and therefore sell books without any competition.
Bueno, acá quiero aclarar una cosa, está siguiendo un orden y más o menos coincide, no sé si a veces agrega algunas cosas, no quiero interrumpirlo, quizá después, bueno, pero es el mismo esqueleto, o sea, si ven que no coincide una cosita, no se preocupen. Sorry, yes.
Yeah, I should say I'm incapable of just reading a text, and so when I talk, I'm following the general plan, but I'm saying whatever comes into my head at the moment, and it's a semi-spontaneous, not fully spontaneous because there's a text, but variations on a theme.
Bueno, no sé si quieren que traduzca o no. Yo estoy, bueno, listo, está bien.
And so, for example, the first press to be established outside the German-speaking world was established in a small town, Subiaco, just outside Rome, but it was established by two German priests, Konrad Sweinheim and Arnold Panhartz. In Venice again, the very first printers were Germans, Johann and Wendelin von Speyer. In Seville, it's the same story. The Coburger family from Germany, they dominated the printing trade in the early years. And again, it's the same story in my own town, Cambridge. In the year 1521, a German arrived in Cambridge from the city of Cologne, and Johann Sieberg became the first individual to print books in Cambridge. In order to do so, he obtained a loan of £20, which is quite a lot of money in 1521, to allow him to found this press. And so, in that sense, we could say he founded a quasi-university press. So, in the 15th century, the printers move mainly for business reasons. But their equivalents in later centuries often moved for religious or political reasons. That is, they were exiles or expatriates. And at this point, I'd like to introduce a distinction between two kinds of printer-publisher. I'm going to describe these two kinds, maybe in a slightly exaggerated way. One group I call mercenaries, and the other group I call missionaries. The mercenaries are the ones that concentrate on publishing whatever they think is going to sell, and they have no scruple in the 16th, 17th centuries at a time of acute controversies. They will publish books on both sides. The same printer prints Catholic books and Protestant books, supporting one political policy and attacking the same policy. But missionaries, on the other hand, publish books that they actually believe in, books supporting religious or political causes to which they're committed. For a 16th century example, I'm thinking of the printers of the works of Martin Luther, that at least in Germany, in the city of Wittenberg, which was the headquarters of Martin Luther's Reformation. There were two German printers, one Hans Luft and the other Melchior Lotter. They were disciples of Luther. So for them, printing these books was part of the good work of the Reformation. Or jumping into the 20th century and taking British examples of left-wing publishers. So the firm of Gollancz and the firm of Lawrence and Wishart. They were committed to publishing books with a Marxist content. They wanted to disseminate these ideas along with the information. As a historian, I can't leave out the fact that one of the most famous works of history published in Britain in the 20th century, Edward Thompson's Making of the Working Class, was indeed published by Gollancz. Now, missionary printers have often chosen exile when they were forbidden to produce the books they believed in at home. And some of them are discussed in a recent book I published about the distinctive role of exiles in the history of knowledge. Book recently published in Brazil in Portuguese translation. So the book focuses on the circulation of people, but in this case of exiles and refugees, and the consequences of that circulation for the history of knowledge. Most of the time, I'm writing about exiled scholars, but there is a place in this book for printers, booksellers, and publishers. For example, in the 16th and 17th centuries, printers were prominent among the religious exiles in Europe. Some Catholics left Protestant countries to avoid persecution. There were 2 Englishmen went to the southern Netherlands, what we now know as Belgium, because it was not safe to publish the books they believed in Elizabethan England. I think one of them is a very interesting, many-sided man called Richard Verstegen, active in Antwerp, who combined several different roles. He was a printer, but he was himself a translator. He was a newswriter at a time of the beginning of news sheets, which we now know as newspapers. And finally, he was the organizer of an intelligence network, probably a spy ring, but in any case, collecting information which he would publish in the news sheets. But conversely, then some Protestants have to leave Catholic countries in order to be safe to print the books they believe in. In the 16th century, an Italian named Pietro Perna left his hometown of Lucca and went to settle in Basel, which was already Protestant. Perna had been a Dominican friar at one time, but then he converted to Protestantism, and then he encouraged the dissemination of the ideas of the Reformation through some of the books that he printed. But he also helped to disseminate the ideas that we associate with the Renaissance. He published not only religious books in Switzerland, he published translations of famous Italian writers, notably Niccolo Machiavelli and his friend Francesco Guicciardini, the greatest historian of the 16th century. He published them in Latin translations made by other Italian Protestants who had joined him in exile in Switzerland. So at that time, many books were translated not only from Latin into European vernaculars, they were also translated from European vernaculars into Latin, because that meant you could sell books from one end of Europe to the other. Another interesting example is Théodore de Brie, who grew up in Liège, but when Liège became a place that it wasn't safe for Protestants to live in, he moved to Frankfurt. Most famous for publishing many volumes, printing descriptions of the New World by travelers there. And once again, he published not only in vernacular languages, but in Latin, so the books could circulate. And the success of the books published by de Brie was assisted by their vivid illustrations, including some notorious engravings of the Spanish conquistadores in the Americas, feeding the children of the Indians to the dogs, thus supporting the notorious Leyenda Negra. When we think about the role of books in the circulation of information, we shouldn't forget the role of books in the circulation of misinformation. But besides the Catholic exiles and the Protestant exiles, there were also Jewish printers who, during the Counter-Reformation, found it was wise to flee from Italy, from Spain, or from Portugal. Some of them went to Amsterdam, a city that became famous in the 17th century as one of the most tolerant parts of Europe. But others, like the Soncino family from northern Italy, decided to flee to the Ottoman Empire. They moved either to Istanbul or Thessalonica. And they set up the first presses in the Ottoman Empire. It's remarkable in a way because in all the Muslim parts of the world at this time, there was an objection to printing, at least printing in the Arabic script, which is what most people knew. But the rulers of the Ottoman Empire had no objection to printers if they printed in Hebrew just for the Jewish minority in the empire. But a still more important role in the history of knowledge was played in the late 17th century by a great exodus of Protestant printers and booksellers who left France when they were forbidden to practice their religion there and also forbidden to practice their trade. About 150,000 Protestants left France at that time. And the printers were a very important minority in that group. We might describe them as the first refugees, at least in the sense that the term refugee was coined in the late 17th century, both in French to talk about réfugiés and in English, refugees, precisely to talk about this group, the Protestants who moved from France and settled mainly in three big cities, Amsterdam, Berlin, and London. And these cities became known as the Refuge. So I just want to mention three examples of printer exiles from that period. Three men, all of whom moved to the Dutch Republic and refounded their printing businesses there. Because all these three men viewed their task as propagating certain kinds of knowledge. The first is Henri Desbordes. He's most famous because he supported a fellow exile, a great scholar and thinker, Pierre Bayle, in two enterprises, founding a cultural journal, which is a new invention of the late 17th century. And the journal was called News from the Republic of Letters, Nouvelles de la République de Lettres. And after that, then the publisher paid Bayle a salary so he could do the research he needed to do to compile a huge historical dictionary, the Dictionnaire historique et critique. It was a reference book, but it was something else as well. It was a vehicle for the original and rather subversive ideas of Bayle. So if you look at the text, the top part of the page, everything is just like an encyclopedia article. It's cool and it's factual. And then there'll be a huge footnote, takes up more space than the article itself. And that's where you turn to discover what the ideas that Bayle wishes to propagate, what they really were. So the second figure I want to mention, Prosper Marchand, again moved from France to the Dutch Republic. He too published a historical dictionary, but he's best known today for having written and himself printed a history of the origin and development of printing. He wasn't alone. Several printers at this time were interested in the history of their own profession. At this time, it was generally believed that Gutenberg had begun to print his books in the city of Mainz in the year 1440. And so a group of German printers got together and decided to celebrate the bicentenary of this of printing, what they called the Jubileum Typographicum. One of them wrote poems to celebrate the occasion. The biggest celebration was in Leipzig, appropriately enough because it was home of a book fair like this one and its rival in Frankfurt. But there were similar celebrations in Strasbourg, in Amsterdam, in Breslau, in Prague. And then 100 years later, again, people still believed that 1440 was the key year. And so Prosper Marchand was celebrating the tercentenary of printing when he published his history. Third example, again, of a missionary printer in exile, Jean-Frédéric Bernard. He spent much of his time and money on an ambitious series of very big books about the ceremonies of all the different religions in the world. And these volumes, like the ones published earlier by Théodore de Brie, they owed part of their popularity to having so many illustrations. And this book made a key contribution to the Enlightenment because it was presenting all the religions of the world in apparently equal terms, and in that way encouraging a tolerance of diversity at a time when it was very much needed. And more generally, the exiled printers, booksellers of this time influenced the cultures they received them because they opened bookshops which made French books available in the Dutch Republic, in England, in Berlin. If you wanted to buy French books in London at the beginning of the 18th century, the place to go was the Strand. And there was a bookshop run by the Vaillant family, Protestant refugees. The difficult thing for the historian to discover is what kind of customers did they have? How far were these French books bought by other French exiles in London? And how far were English-speaking people going there to buy and read the books? But equally important, these exiled printers and the books that they published made an impact on the culture which they'd left behind. For example, the French became familiar at the end of the 17th century with the ideas of the English philosopher John Locke, because an exile in London, Pierre Coste, translated them into very good French. I'm now going to jump 200 years from the early 18th century to the early 20th century. Once again, certain printers and publishers and booksellers migrated for business reasons. I'm thinking in particular of a remarkable man to whom I was introduced by my father when I was a child, and that was an antiquarian bookseller in London called Ernest Goldschmidt. Goldschmidt came from Vienna. In the 1920s, thanks partly to economic problems like inflation, he decided to move his book business and opened a shop in fashionable Bond Street. But what's interesting about him is in his spare time, he was a scholar, and he published a very important study of the printed book of the Renaissance, as well as a monograph on that 16th century printer Johann Sieberg that I mentioned before because he decided to set up shop in Cambridge. So Goldschmidt's book about Sieberg was published appropriately enough by Cambridge University Press. But of course, many other exiled printers and publishers came for more political reasons. The early 20th century was unfortunately a great age of political exiles. Refugees from so many different regimes. The regime of Lenin, the regime of Admiral Horthy in Hungary, of Hitler, of Franco, and so on. and those refugees included a considerable number of publishers. Take the case of the Russians, who either chose to leave or were forced to leave Russia after the Bolshevik Revolution, or more often after the Russian Civil War ended with the victory of the Reds. So by the early 1920s, in Berlin alone, there were 80 Russian publishers printing both books and journals, almost certainly entirely for their fellow Russian exiles, because, as you can imagine, there would not be many Germans in Berlin who could easily read Russian. Or another well-known collective example, a group of publishers in exile, Hungarians in London. Sometimes they'd fled from the Soviet Republic of Bela Kun, established in 1919. Sometimes they'd fled from the White Terror established by Admiral Horthy afterwards. Sometimes they'd moved to Germany and had to flee again in the age of Hitler after 1933. But in any case, well-known names from the group: André Deutsch, who went on publishing books for many years in London, Paul Ehrlich, and Bela Horowitz, who founded the Phaidon Press in England, together with a fellow exile from Austria. And Hungarian scholars also fled at this time. For some reason, they were particularly prominent in two disciplines: art history and sociology. Major art historians like Friedrich Ontal, Arnold Hauser, and famous economists, or they later became famous, Thomas Barlog and Nicholas Kaldor, both of whom became members of the House of Lords in a Labour government after the war. And Austrian exiles too, mainly Jewish, made a major contribution to intellectual life in Britain at this time. Publishers like George Weidenfeld, Ludwig Goldscheider, who was the other half of Phaidon Press, Walter Neurath, who founded Thames and Hudson, and alongside, again, refugee scholars such as the philosopher Karl Popper and the art historian Ernst Gombrich. And so it was thanks to this Austrian connection that it was the Phaidon Press who published Gombrich's History of Art. In fact, they struck gold, because that single book has, from when it was first published, 1950, to now, it has sold over 7 million copies worldwide. So in Britain, as in the United States, I think it was the Central European Jewish exiles who were the most important group. Now here, I suppose, the equivalent group would be the refugees from the Franco regime, the Republicans who left when they realized in 1939 that they had lost the Civil War. Spanish exiles in Mexico created a number of small publishing houses, as well as the more famous Fondo de Cultura Económica, which I'm happy to see has a stall here today, and which in its early days published translations of works on history, famous works on history. Marcel Bataillon's book on Erasmus in Spain, Marc Bloch's book on feudal society, and Fernand Braudel's great book on the Mediterranean, published in French in 1949, already available here in Spanish America by 1953. And considering that volume in its first edition was already 900 pages long, I think that to publish a translation only 4 years later is moving quite fast. Here in Argentina, I don't need to tell you that Gonzalo Losada was an exile who had worked for Espasa Calpe before he founded the editorial Losada, which again I'm happy to see represented in this fair, founded it in 1938. And the new firm became a refuge for other exiles in the same way that in the late 17th century, French exile printers used to employ their fellow exiles as authors, as translators, and even as proofreaders, kind of exile solidarity. Now, printers and publishers have played a particularly important role, I think, in certain forms of the dissemination of knowledge, and one of the most obvious of these is the encyclopedia.
Están siguiendo más o menos porque se aparta un poquito, pero el esqueleto es el mismo. No lo quiero interrumpir por eso. Después hago las preguntas, podemos ampliar alguna cosa.
Up to the 17th century, it was possible for single scholars to produce encyclopedias by themselves before the expansion and fragmentation of knowledge, which was itself a result of the multiplication of books. But from the 18th century on, encyclopedias were the work of teams of writers and scholars. And hence, they became known to the world by the names of their publishers rather than the contributors, as in the famous cases Chambers, Zedler, Brockhaus, and Larousse. Ephraim Chambers was an Englishman who actually became a publisher because he wanted to print an encyclopedia rather than becoming a publisher first and then looking around for what to print. And his encyclopedia, to which he contributed himself, was quite successful in Britain, was translated into Italian, but still more important, there was a plan to translate it into French, but in the course of this operation, the book was totally transformed and it became the famous Encyclopédie edited by Diderot and d'Alembert. Then, still more ambitious, actually, at least in scale, was the enterprise begun by Johann Heinrich Zedler, bookseller and publisher in Leipzig, because he decided he would publish a much bigger encyclopedia than anybody had ever done before, at least in the West. He probably didn't know that there was a tradition in China of compiling and sometimes printing even bigger encyclopedias. So he settled on 64 volumes. It took 20 years for these volumes to be published. The Grosses Universal Lexikon, and led to what historians call a publisher's war, because his rivals, whose sales were threatened by this publication, reacted by saying and writing bad things about him. Recently, a German scholar called Zedler's enterprise the Wikipedia of the 18th century. But in the 19th century equivalent of Zedler, still in Germany, was Friedrich Arnold Brockhaus. His first encyclopedia was quite a modest one, came out in 1810 with the apparently odd title of the Konversationslexikon. I think the point was that he wanted people to buy it in order to be able to show off in conversation. Or if they didn't want to show off, they needed to consult the encyclopedia to understand what the people who were showing off were saying, what they were alluding to. Anyway, the book was very successful, and so much so, the Brockhaus family continued publishing encyclopedias for 200 years. They finally went online and sold the rights as recently as the year 2009. Their French equivalent was, of course, Larousse. Pierre Larousse began publishing what he called his Grand Dictionnaire in 1863, and then it continued to be reprinted, updated, and of course enlarged because of more and more knowledge becoming available. Encyclopedias have had to get bigger and bigger. The firm still exists in a sense, but it's been swallowed by another publisher, Hachette. So I think encyclopedias are one of the most obvious cases of what you could call the creative intervention of publishers in the circulation of knowledge. But a second important initiative, I think, is the series. Already in the 16th century, an Italian publisher had the idea that if books were arranged in a series, they might sell even better than individually. And this publisher devised a rather elegant poetic name for a series. He called it a collana, which means a necklace. And to this day, Italian publishers still use the word collana for a series. Anyway, to come back to the circulation of knowledge, in early 20th century France, the publisher Albin Michel, for example, commissioned the polymath scholar Henri Baer to edit a very ambitious series called The Evolution of Humanity. And famous historians like Marc Bloch and Lucien Febvre published some of their best-known books in this particular series. In England, too, there was one publisher particularly active in setting up series, and this was Routledge and Kegan Paul, now known as Routledge, but it used to be a combination. So Routledge commissioned another polymath called Charles Ogden to edit a series called the International Library of Psychology, Philosophy, and Scientific Method. Very successful in the sense more than 200 volumes were published in that series. And Routledge again, they founded another series edited by the exiled sociologist, the Hungarian Karl Mannheim. And the series was called the International Library of Sociology and Social Reconstruction, in which Mannheim was attempting to introduce sociology to the British. With less success than he hoped for, he's rather bitter about this in his correspondence at the time, but he went on trying. Now, I'd like to conclude this talk with a few remarks about the very idea of disseminating knowledge. It's a vivid metaphor. You're sowing seeds, sometimes they grow into something that you hadn't expected. I think that the metaphor of sowing seeds is less misleading than other metaphors, like the transfer of knowledge, as if it was moved from place to place on a train, or the diffusion of knowledge as if it was flowing along like a river or an oil slick, and as if the knowledge remained unchanged in the course of its journey. Because, on the contrary, recent studies in the history of knowledge have shown again and again that the messages that the authors of books want to send are not always the same as the messages that the readers receive. Varying, of course, whether the reader is somebody who shares a culture with the author, or maybe when the book is translated, comes from a very different culture. from the author. So, therefore, the message of a book changes partly thanks to misunderstanding when the author and the reader speak different languages, but there's also the conscious adaptation of foreign knowledge and foreign ideas to new situations. A vivid example of what this can mean comes from the history of missions and missionaries. This time I'm using the word missionary in the completely literal sense, not as a metaphor for publishers. Christian missionaries from the 16th century onwards went to convert, as they put it, peoples in many parts of the world, by which they meant to persuade them to give up their own religion and to accept Christianity as a replacement. But one historical study after another has made it very clear that the people being converted from Japan to Africa or South America often saw absolutely no reason to reject their traditional beliefs, but they simply accepted the Christian package, if you like, as an add-on and not as a substitute. And there is a very similar situation in the case of books, as many studies of the reception of particular authors in different countries make very clear. As the ancient Romans used to say, habent sua fata libelli. So you write the book, it goes, but once it's been published, it's out of your control. And you can watch with fascination, maybe sometimes with horror, you discover how other people are understanding and using your book. So from the sender's point of view, and the author's point of view, active reception, as it's often called, very often seems to be a kind of treason. But on the other hand, if we accept the reader's point of view, it's a kind of freedom. In any case, the example of messages that change while they circulate is only one example among many in history of the importance of unintended consequences. And I think that example makes clear that the history of the book, and indeed the history of knowledge, are quite inseparable from history in general. And that was indeed why I needed to talk a bit about politics and about the history of religion in a talk that was called The Dissemination of Knowledge. Thank you for your attention.